My sister's husband's relatives began whispering and laughing as I walked in alone. The noise was quiet, like rain behind a closed window, but it pierced me with the same cold sharpness. Every glance, every fleeting turn of a head, felt like a blow, not to the body but to my dignity. In this hall filled with unfamiliar voices, I didn't feel like a guest or someone invited. I felt like something unnecessary, forgotten, left behind, like a mistake noticed too late. I walked slowly, hearing the whispers and chuckles behind me. No voice called out, no eyes waited. All I saw in front of me were backs, turned shoulders, faces lit by false smiles. Everything here breathed pretense. The air was heavy, like before a storm. The flowers smelled overly sweet, as if trying to mask something rotting beneath their petals. Inside, I was half ruined. I held myself together, not for someone, not out of strength, but out of principle, so they wouldn't see the cracks, so they wouldn't gain power over what was still alive in me. As I approached the center of the room, it became clear. Everyone already knew, or thought they did. They expected me to lower my gaze, to feel ashamed, to turn away and find a quiet corner in which to disappear. But I didn't disappear. I stood there, alone, amid the noise, the lights, the smells of someone else's celebration. To the right, someone smirked. To the left, one of the women whispered something to another, covering her lips with a hand adorned with rings, as if wealth could hide the venom in her words. Their laughter was restrained, but precise. It struck where it hurt. No one came over. No one reached out a hand. It was a boycott, elegantly masked as polite detachment. But I knew, behind that thin veil was cruelty, sharpened by years of family pretense. Somewhere deep in the hall, music played. Soulless, like background noise in a cheap film, it tried to soften the atmosphere. But it couldn't. The room was too cold, not in temperature but in attitude. Even the walls seemed to breathe judgment. I stopped by one of the tables, pretending to look for a seat. There was plenty of space, but not where the insiders sat. The chairs near them seemed slightly turned away, like the bodies of people unwilling to acknowledge your presence. These small details, the placement of napkins, the lack of eye contact, the slowed conversations, spoke louder than any scream. I saw someone point at me, as if I weren't a guest but an exhibit. Not a person, but a symbol of something shameful. Their eyes didn't ask. They declared. They judged. They decided for me who I was and who I ought to be. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't. I didn't allow myself. Standing among the chandelier's light and the shadows of other people's souls, I felt the emptiness inside me grow heavier. It seemed that if I took even one more step, the weight of it. But I didn't move. I waited, and that was when something happened. Something that tore through the fabric of that wretched symphony. One of the elders, a man with graying temples and a straight back, stood up. He was a distant relative of the groom, almost invisible until that moment. He rose, turned to face me, and without saying a word, bowed. In front of the entire room, and everything stopped. For a moment, the room lost its rhythm. Conversations stalled mid-sentence, hands froze in midair with glasses half raised, and even the music seemed to retreat into the background like a guilty accomplice. The air became denser, not heavier but more alive, thick with stunned silence, awkwardness, and the palpable shifting of perspectives. No one moved. The man remained bowed, his posture unwavering, as though time itself had granted him immunity from the stares, the whispers, the unspoken questions spreading like wildfire. His gesture was not flamboyant, not theatrical. It was sincere, deliberate, and dangerously dignified. It tore through the fabric of politeness and pettiness that had suffocated the evening. In that single act, he did not just acknowledge someone cast aside. He restored something everyone else had tried to bury: presence. People began to look, not just glance, look. Some turned their heads slowly, as if afraid they might be seen doing so. Others shifted in their seats, suddenly unsure whether their silence had made them complicit. The laughter had died out completely. Only discomfort remained in its place, curling along the edges of every carefully constructed social mask. It was not admiration that filled the room in the seconds after the bow. It was tension, raw, uncomfortable, unedited. As if everyone had been caught in the act of something shameful, and now the mirror was placed right in front of them. He straightened slowly with the kind of grace that belonged not to wealth or power, but to conviction. Then, without a word or signal, he walked to an empty chair near the center and sat back down as though nothing had happened. Yet everything had. The moment was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. No gasps, no applause, no protest. But that was precisely what made it more powerful. It was a rupture in a ritual, a wound torn open in a place meant only for display. And the wound could not be ignored. People resumed their conversations, but their words were now dipped in hesitation. Laughter returned, but it was thinner, more brittle, breaking easily like porcelain under pressure. There were no more pointed fingers, no more sneers made in plain sight. That easy mockery, once so free-flowing, had turned sour in their mouths. Yet the silence between people began to say more than their voices ever could. Across the room, some avoided eye contact altogether. Others tried to make sense of what they'd just witnessed, their minds racing through excuses, rationalizations, or subtle retreats into the comfort of indifference. But not everyone could escape. One woman who had earlier covered her lips with jeweled fingers now sat still, unmoving, her eyes following the figure who had bowed. Not with admiration, no, something else, as if trying to measure the cost of that action against the weight of her own inaction. It wasn't regret, it was recognition. The music picked up again, soft and melodic, trying to mend the tear, trying to smooth over the roughness that had settled like dust over polished surfaces. But it was too late. The fracture had already been made, and those attuned to silence could still hear it echoing. In the midst of all this, the one who had been the target of mockery still stood in place, unmoving, not triumphant, not humbled, simply still.
Like a tree in the eye of a storm, untouched, yet surrounded by chaos. There was no need to speak, no urge to claim anything. The room had done the work. The shame that had once sat like a second skin was gone, not replaced by pride, but by clarity. There was no longing for approval, no desire to be seen differently, only the strange, unexpected peace that comes when the cruel symmetry of judgment is broken by one act of kindness too brave to ignore. And though many would forget the moment, pretend it never happened, some would not. Some would remember the way the room had changed, the way their breath had caught in their throat. They would not speak of it, not openly, but it would live with them, quietly haunting the way they measured others in the future. Because once someone bows in your direction, not out of pity, not out of obligation, but from quiet respect, you never forget the way it feels to be seen.
Long after the music had resumed, after the glasses had clinked and small laughter cautiously returned like children testing ice, something had shifted beneath the floorboards of the evening. The event, in its schedule and structure, continued. Dishes were served, candles flickered, and camera flashes resumed their impatient blinking. But a thread had been pulled from the carefully embroidered fabric of tradition, and though the gown of celebration still held its shape, everyone could feel that looseness, that vulnerability. There were no grand confrontations, no apologies, no public acknowledgments, but silence became heavier. And where before it had been a tool of exclusion, now it was a mirror to self-awareness. People moved differently now, more cautiously, some even guiltily. The room, once buoyed by certainty and social rhythm, now carried the tremor of exposed judgment. Some tried to resume the performance. They raised their voices, tossed casual remarks into the air, filled the spaces with exaggerated smiles. But those efforts fell flat. No one could rewind what had happened. The bow, though brief, had the permanence of a scar. It marked the evening in a way no decoration or speech ever could. There were guests who observed all this not from the center but from the periphery. Not participants, but witnesses. They had noticed the isolation long before the gesture, but had told themselves it wasn't their place, or their problem. Now, in the aftermath, they stood silently, the weight of their neutrality pressing against their ribs. Some avoided looking toward the center of the room. Others glanced quickly, as if to reassure themselves that the one they had ignored was still real, still standing. A few, brave or restless or perhaps moved by conscience, took small steps. A nod here, a slight tilt of the head, gestures too small to be called kindness, but too deliberate to be meaningless. These were the hesitant beginnings of unspoken accountability, not enough to erase the earlier cruelty, but enough to begin rewriting the narrative. The man who had bowed did not explain himself. He didn't need to. His action had not asked for attention, only justice. That kind of quiet defiance does not require repetition. It lingers, deepens, and speaks on its own.
In the minds of some, he became a symbol, not of rebellion, but of integrity. In the minds of others, a problem, an interruption, a disruption of comfort. But in the heart of it all stood the one who had walked in alone, still silent, still steady, not in resistance, but in presence. There is a kind of strength that doesn't announce itself with clenched fists or raised voices. It lives in the act of continuing to exist where one has been made to feel unwelcome. It grows in the refusal to shrink. Later in the evening, photos would be taken, carefully curated to erase the earlier moment. Tables would be cleared, chairs stacked, and the room would be swept clean of confetti and crumbs. But what had happened could not be swept away. The bow had settled into the walls, into the glances, into the tension beneath every casual word exchanged afterward. No one would talk about it openly, but in the hours that followed, in quiet corners and in car rides home, it would resurface. Whispered questions, subtle reconsiderations, reflections not of the one who was bowed to, but of the ones who had failed to bow when it mattered most. Some would dismiss it. Others would feel the unease curl in their chest and not know why. A few would carry it like a stone in their pocket, something weighty, private, uncomfortable but necessary. And among them, a slow understanding would begin to take root. That dignity cannot be assigned or withdrawn by majority vote. That presence, when maintained under scrutiny, has more weight than praise. And that a room, no matter how beautifully decorated, becomes a poorer place when it mocks those who walk in alone. It wasn't redemption, not yet. But it was the start of silence being used not to exclude, but to listen.
As the evening wore on, the light in the hall changed. It wasn't just the dimming of chandeliers or the shift in ambience. It was something subtler, like the soft tarnishing of gold. The celebration continued, yes, but it no longer glowed. The energy had dulled. Smiles felt delayed just enough to reveal their construction. Some people leaned harder into the party. They drank more quickly, laughed a little louder, tapped their feet to the music with a rhythm almost too precise, trying, desperately, to bury what had surfaced earlier. But you cannot party your way out of a fracture, not when it happens in silence and under your own roof. Others drifted. From conversation, from obligation, from the performance of joy. They became ghosts inside their own evening wear, eyes not searching for fun anymore, but for answers. Answers to questions they hadn't known they'd been avoiding. Where did the laughter come from before? Why was it so easy to turn away from someone? Why had one small gesture shaken them so deeply? Because it was never about the bow alone. It was about what the bow illuminated. The exposure of a group's unkindness, the quiet courage of one who stood outside it. The unbearable weight of a truth too many had chosen to ignore. The gesture had cracked the surface, but what lay beneath had always been there, waiting. In a far corner of the hall, there were those who said nothing at all, not from disdain, but because they were thinking too deeply to speak. They watched the room the way someone watches waves after an earthquake, searching not for drama, but for pattern. What would shift next? Who would be the first to act differently? One guest, older and elegant, moved with careful deliberation now. Earlier in the evening, her glances had been as sharp as her jewelry, each one slicing across the room with practiced ease. But now her gaze softened, lost focus. Her hands no longer rested in judgmental poise, but folded gently in front of her, as if unsure what they should hold. Her mind replayed the moment again and again, not because she regretted it, but because she had not expected to be moved. And that movement disturbed her more than she'd admit. Elsewhere, a younger guest, one who had once tried to catch attention with loud opinions, sat with a plate untouched. The noise, the food, the decor, it all felt suddenly artificial. He had never noticed before how performative it all was, or perhaps he had, but had mistaken it for tradition. Now he questioned if tradition was just habit dressed in ceremony, and whether habit could be cruel if left unchallenged long enough. And in the eye of this social shift stood the quiet presence that had walked in alone. There was no effort to reclaim space, no desperate attempt to become central. It wasn't a reclaiming of dignity, it was the refusal to have ever surrendered it. That kind of stillness was louder than any toast. It made people reconsider the definitions they'd been handed about belonging, worth, and presence. The staff, unnoticed for most of the night, also shifted. Their movements became more deliberate, their eyes less glazed. They had seen it too. Not the bow itself, but the atmosphere that followed. And in their glances was a kind of silent validation. Yes, we saw. Yes, it mattered, even if we cannot speak it. As candles burned lower, and the music tried one last time to resuscitate the night's earlier rhythm, it became clear that the evening had changed direction. It would not end in the triumphant crescendo that had been planned. No amount of dancing or dessert could erase what had been revealed. The celebration had cracked, but in that crack, something honest had taken root, something that did not rely on photos or speeches or decoration. It was not beautiful, but it was real. Some would try to forget, others would try to rewrite. A few would pretend nothing had happened at all. But a rare few, the ones who had truly watched, truly listened, would remember, not out of sentiment, but out of necessity, because they had seen the cost of silence, and they had felt the weight of a simple bow. Not all lessons come wrapped in ceremony. Some come like interruptions, quiet, inconvenient, unforgettable. By the time the final song played, the air in the hall had thinned, not from exhaustion, but from emotional erosion. The celebration had, on the surface, followed its intended course. Meals served, speeches made, music played, but it was as if the evening had unfolded in two layers, one visible, polished, public, the other unspoken, subterranean, quietly unraveling. As guests gathered their coats and gifts, the usual farewells lacked their usual warmth. There were no lingering embraces, no exaggerated praise about the decor or the food. Instead, people left in clusters or alone, speaking in low voices or not at all, their steps echoing faintly in the emptied corners of the once vibrant hall. And through all this, a memory took shape, not just of the bow itself, but of what it revealed about everyone who had been there. In a place meant to honor union, the gesture had exposed separation between how people wanted to be seen and who they had become in the shadows of their silence. There were those who walked out relieved, glad that the night had ended without confrontation. They told themselves the moment was small, isolated, insignificant, a hiccup in an otherwise smooth affair, but even in their attempts to forget, they carried fragments with them. The way the room had gone quiet, the faces that had turned away, the sense, however faint, that something had been missed that could not be regained. Others left in contemplation. They did not speak of the bow, but it remained with them like an imprint, delicate yet persistent. It forced them to consider not what had been done, but what had not. They found themselves reflecting on past occasions, other weddings, other rooms, wondering how often they had stood in silence when someone else stood alone, and still others left changed in ways they could not describe. Not transformed, but tilted, just enough to notice the slope they hadn't realized they were standing on. For them, the evening would become a private milestone. The day they began to see exclusion not as a passive absence, but as a constructed presence maintained by many and challenged by few. The hall, once emptied, seemed to sigh. The chairs, the tablecloths, the withering flowers, they all looked tired, as though they too had been holding something in. The silence was no longer tense. It was reflective, honest. It no longer pressed down, but settled across surfaces like dust, finally given permission to rest. Behind the scenes, some of the staff lingered a little longer than usual. Their cleanup was slower, quieter. They had worked through the entire evening with trained detachment, their motions choreographed to avoid notice. But even they were different now. They exchanged fewer words, but their eyes met more often. There was something human, something real, exchanged in those glances. Acknowledgement, perhaps, or respect. And still, at the center of it all, the person who had walked in alone remained unchanged in posture, yet irrevocably altered in perception. This had never been about triumph. There was no victory in surviving cruelty, but there was something else, something steadier, confirmation. That silence can be endured, and shame can be returned to its sender. That sometimes it only takes one disruption, a bow, a glance, a pause, to upset an entire architecture built on unspoken rules. No one offered apologies. None were expected. This was not the kind of story that resolves with amends or reconciliation, but something more lasting had been planted in its place, memory. In time, that memory would lose its edges. It would fade in detail. People would misremember the music that had played before the bow or the color of the dress worn by someone nearby. But they would not forget the feeling, the way the air shifted, the way their hearts reacted before their minds could. Because some moments don't stay in the past. They revisit, in boardrooms, at family dinners, in chance encounters. Whenever someone stands apart and others decide how to respond, the bow would live on, not in legend, not in gossip, but in decision. And somewhere in the quiet that followed the end of the evening, beneath all the unspoken thoughts and unfinished glances, the most enduring part of the story settled into place. Not what happened, but how people responded when it did. The morning after held none of the clarity people expected from a new day. The sun rose, but it brought no resolution, only light. And in that light, details once hidden by evening's charm became visible again. The subtle stains on linen, the discarded glasses with lipstick marks, the chairs pushed out of alignment, the celebration, now disassembled, looked more like an aftermath than a memory. For most, the day began as it always did. Coffee, movement, the vague fatigue of a night too long and too loud. But beneath those routines lived a quiet disturbance, a thought that kept returning in different shapes. The moment, not spoken aloud, not shared, but replayed, silently, individually, as though it had become a personal test everyone had either passed or failed. Some tried to write it off. They told themselves it had been nothing, just an awkward pause in an otherwise lovely event. Others leaned on that excuse like a crutch, but even they couldn't explain why their minds circled back to it with such persistence. If it had been nothing, why did it feel so much like a question they hadn't answered? There were those who found themselves unexpectedly angry, not at the one who had bowed, but at the discomfort he had forced into the room. That discomfort still clung to them. It interrupted their thoughts during breakfast. It sat beside them in silence as they looked through photos on their phones. Images that were meant to preserve joy now looked curated, artificial, dishonest. The forced symmetry of posed smiles, the careful cropping of reality, it all felt thin now, transparent. One guest stared at a picture for a long time, a group shot, with everyone smiling, glasses raised, elegance choreographed. And yet, at the edge of the frame, almost out of focus, stood the one who had arrived alone, not smiling, not defiant, simply there. The guest zoomed in slowly, as if by getting closer they might find answers. But the face did not offer anything. It did not accuse or plead. It just was. And that presence, once dismissed, now took up more space in their mind than all the joy combined. Elsewhere, another guest walked through a quiet room, the remnants of the celebration still visible. Folded tablecloths, box decorations, the scent of candle wax still lingering. She reached out and touched a single glass that hadn't been cleared, a small act, meaningless in action but full of contemplation. Her thoughts did not form words, but questions. Had she laughed? Had she looked away? Had she been kind or merely compliant? No answers came. For some, the moment planted itself like a splinter, barely visible, but sharp when touched. They found themselves growing quiet at lunch tables, zoning out during phone calls, staring too long at nothing in particular. Not because they were consumed by guilt, but because they had glimpsed something they could not unsee. The fragility of comfort built on someone else's exclusion. Among all this, the one who had been at the center of it did not seek explanation or validation. The next day came like any other. There were no expectations of change, no fantasies of regret or justice. There was only the quiet relief of having endured. The memory of the bow, however, remained, not as triumph, but as confirmation that silence can be broken in small ways, and that sometimes one gesture is enough to fracture a pattern. And while most would not speak of it aloud, the event had already begun to shift something beneath the surface of their lives. In conversations days later, there would be longer pauses before casual judgment. In future gatherings, there would be glances, not of guilt, but of watchfulness, toward those standing alone. A new awareness had begun to take root, not yet behavior, but consciousness. People rarely change all at once, but they remember what made them pause, what made them uncomfortable. And over time, if that discomfort is strong enough, it rewires the way they see the world. The gesture, a simple bow, had not demanded change. It had not even asked to be seen, but it had been. And now it lived on, not just in the minds of those who watched, but in the subtle shifts in how they moved through the world after. The day moved forward, errands were run, voices laughed again. But beneath the surface of ordinary life, something unusual remained. The lingering echo of a room forced to confront itself. Days turned into weeks, and the memory of that night, rather than fading, began to crystallize. It did not scream. It did not demand retelling. But it returned, subtly, insistently, each time someone found themselves in a room filled with laughter, yet noticed someone standing alone. The gesture had seated itself in the mind like a silent witness. It appeared in unexpected places. At a conference where a young speaker fumbled through a presentation, while others smirked behind coffee cups. In a cafe where someone sat at a corner table, ignored by their former friends. At a birthday dinner where the odd one out received polite but hollow smiles. And in those moments, something would shift, almost imperceptibly. A hand reaching out sooner, a seat pulled closer, a silence not filled with laughter but with listening. Not everyone felt it, but some did. Some began noticing things they had never paid attention to before. Who was missing from group photos, who was never asked a second question, whose presence made others uncomfortable, not because of who they were, but because of what they represented. Difference, independence, a refusal to conform. It was not guilt that motivated this awareness. It was recognition. The bow had not been grand. It had been simple, deliberate, unaccompanied by words or dramatics. And yet, it had been enough to awaken something that no lecture or confrontation ever could. It had bypassed defenses and gone straight to where people could not lie to themselves, their instincts, their first reactions, their silent choices. And now, when they laughed too loudly at someone's expense, something would pull back. Not shame, but memory. Not always enough to stop the behavior, but enough to question it, enough to pause. A few spoke about it, eventually. Not in large groups, not on public platforms, but in quiet, one-on-one conversations. Sometimes with people they trusted, sometimes with themselves. They used vague language. That moment, you remember? Or something changed that night. And every time the other person would nod, not because they had discussed it before, but because the truth of it was undeniable. Others said nothing but carried it in their posture, in how they greeted someone, in how they responded when a joke turned mean, in how they positioned themselves in spaces where someone had been pushed out to the edge. The gesture had become a measure, not of others, but of self. A private question to be answered again and again. What do I do when someone is alone in the room? And over time, that question did not feel like a burden. It became a compass. Meanwhile, the story of the event itself began to mutate, as stories do. Some remembered the gesture vividly, others softened it into metaphor. A few retold it at dinner parties as a tale of drama at a wedding, never realizing they were diminishing something that had shaken them to their core. But even in that retelling, it lived on. Even misremembered, the bow still had power. And at other weddings, at other tables, people carried that invisible memory with them. They glanced across rooms not just with curiosity, but with responsibility. Some still failed. They looked away, they whispered, they laughed. But others remembered, others moved. The one who had walked in alone that night never retold the story. It did not need to be shared to be real. The gesture had not been made for credit or redemption. It had been made for dignity. Not a reclaimed dignity, but an affirmed one. And now, That dignity moved through others like a quiet current, touching places where silence used to rule, creating space where none had been offered before. This was not a story of transformation, it was a story of echo. Because sometimes, the most powerful moments are not the ones repeated, but the ones remembered when it matters most. And somewhere, weeks later, at a completely different event, a young woman stood alone in a corner, unsure why no one spoke to her. The room buzzed, the music played, and then someone noticed. They walked over. They didn't speak right away. They didn't offer pity, just presence. And though the moment passed quietly, without fanfare, without any acknowledgement, something had shifted. Again. Time moved forward, as it always does, carrying with it the echoes of moments both grand and small. The memory of that bow, quiet, deliberate, unadorned, did not disappear. It settled instead into the spaces between words, into the pauses in conversations, into the unnoticed glances exchanged when no one else was looking. It became a quiet marker in the lives of those who had witnessed it, a reminder that dignity does not require an audience and courage does not need applause. The gesture had been small, but its reverberations stretched far beyond the walls of that one evening. In the weeks and months that followed, some found themselves more aware, not just of others, but of their own actions. It was as if the memory had opened a door that could never be fully closed again. They saw how easily people could be overlooked, dismissed, or made invisible. And with that seeing came responsibility. There was no grand reckoning, no sweeping changes announced in speeches or written in social media posts. Change, if it came at all, came quietly, in the choice to include rather than exclude, to listen rather than judge, to stand with rather than apart. Occasions continued, celebrations went on, and rooms continued to fill and empty. But in some of those rooms, there was a difference, an extra glance, a softer word, a subtle shift in seating, a moment given without demand, a presence acknowledged without condition. The bow had done its work. For the one who had walked in alone, the gesture was never about confrontation or revenge. It was a quiet assertion of self-worth, a refusal to be erased. And in doing so, it had unsettled more than just the guests that night. It had unsettled a pattern, a norm, an unspoken agreement to ignore. What followed was neither swift nor loud. It was the slow unfolding of awareness, the gradual accumulation of small acts that built toward something new. Sometimes, the most profound changes are the ones no one notices until they have already happened. And so, life moved on, as it always does. But in the hearts of those who saw and those who remembered, the night carried a lasting truth. That dignity is not granted by others. It is claimed by the brave, that courage can be as simple as a bow, and that sometimes, one quiet act is enough to change everything.